Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to our series, Key Battles in the Revolutionary War. We're at Key Battle 7, Rhode Island, which happens in 1778. This is something that is overlooked in the Revolutionary War. And just a brief note before we jump in. There are things that we remember, like Saratoga and Trenton in the Revolutionary War, if we remember things, because they have decisive outcomes. There are also things we remember, like the Boston Tea Party, but they weren't the only one of their kind, because there were other tea parties that were happening, noticeable demonstrations against British power. And there are lots of little skirmishes and battles happening all over the colonies. Patriots and Redcoats are fighting numerous engagements on land and on sea in pivotal battles, but there's a lot of things that are forgotten. An example of one thing that is forgotten before we get into Rhode Island is the expedition to Mississippi by George Rogers Clark that culminates in taking of Vincennes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Well, we don't know about this, but very, very long story short, this was arguably the only reason that the British gave up the Old Northwest at the Treaty of Paris. But we've almost forgotten about this tour, and why are some things remembered and some things not? There are also abortive attempts to conquer Canada and Florida, and other little things to get additional territory, and Clark's expedition is successful. But there's other campaigns and battles that have faded from history, and Rhode Island hasn't faded from history, but it's overlooked. So with that introduction, James, set us up with a background. What is happening that is going to lead to battle in Rhode Island?
Right. Well, Rhode Island was obviously the smallest colony geographically, but it's more important than people think, especially during the Revolutionary War era. Newport in particular, Newport, Rhode Island, was the fourth largest city in the 13 colonies in the 1770s. It had 9,500 residents, and they used over 750 ships in commerce. And it was on an island and was easily defendable. It had an excellent harbor in which a fleet could winter, and it rarely froze. And so for that reason, it was extremely important commercially as well as from a naval perspective. General Howe wanted to take Newport because it's such a good port, and doing so was part of his plan to end the war in 1777. We saw in a previous episode that part of his plan was also to take Philadelphia, which they did, but then they just ended up giving it right back. But the complete capture of New York City, which we saw again in another episode quite some time ago, that was in 1776. The capture of New York City freed up soldiers for an expedition to Newport. So Howe put together an invasion force of 7,100, which was composed more specifically of 4,000 British regulars and 3,100 Hessians. There's our old friends, the Hessians again. They just keep popping up everywhere.
Before they desert, of course.
Right, yes. And this force of 7,100 boarded ships in late November of 1776. And the first of the attackers landed on Aquidneck, and forgive me if I pronounce that wrong, Rhode Islanders. I looked up the pronunciation a while ago, but I've forgotten. But Aquidneck, which is also Rhode Island, that's the island that Newport is on. They landed on December 8th, just north of Newport, and soon afterward, the remainder of the force landed. And the British captured the city without much opposition. Soon they took control all of Aquidneck Island, but the rest of the state remained firmly in Patriot hands. So it's kind of almost like another Boston situation or like New York City later on where they control the island, or of course Boston is not an island, but it was close. While the Patriots or the Americans control the surrounding area. Many pro-independence Patriots left town. That means they left Newport, while loyalist Tories remained, and another theme we've seen again and again. About 1,700 captive American seamen were forced into prison ships in Newport Harbor. At some point, we're going to talk about those prison ships in a little bit more detail, but I think for now we'll pass on that.
Right. Well, just one small thing with that. If I understand correctly, if you were taken into a prison ship, was it almost a death sentence? Do I have that right?
Yeah, well, let's just go ahead and talk a little bit about that since why not?
Yeah.
I'm flexible. Yes, they were miserable places to be. They were a very efficient way to house prisoners from the British perspective, because if you think about it, where are the British going to put their prisoners? They don't have a lot of secure places on land. And at any rate, prisons were very easily fled from or escaped from back in those days. You could often bribe the guards, or you didn't have enough people to guard the prison. But these ships solved the problem, at least from the British perspective. They were old ships that weren't being used as warships anymore, but they would pack people in there. There would be too many people in too small of a space. Disease was absolutely rampant. They were squalid, unsanitary. You can imagine, there's no place there's no fresh air, and they didn't give them enough food, and they gave them horrible food. So a lot of people died. So yeah, it pretty much was a death sentence. I don't know what percent of people that were captive on prison ships died, but I know it was a significant percent.
Yeah, this is the age of the Atlantic economy, the triangle trade, an active slave trade. So people know how to pack other humans into ships in absolutely inhumane conditions. And this is something else to think about the war, that if you're a patriot and you're considering surrender, and you know that surrender means being packed on one of those ships, that's going to force people into desperate conditions. And waging a battle, if your enemy is cornered, they're going to be probably more vicious than they would otherwise. So yeah, think about that on the other side when people are fighting and considering surrender or not. All right, well, yeah, this is taken, and how does the Continental Army respond?
Well, they want it back.
Makes sense.
Take my property. I'm going to try to take it back. So the governors of New England, the various states, they called out their militias, and thousands responded. They occupied the parts of the state that is Rhode Island, not controlled by the British. But there's still this annoying feature of all these British and Hessian soldiers in Newport and on the Rhode or Aquidneck Island. But, by the way, so General Washington is not directly involved in this campaign, but of course, as the overall commander-in-chief, he is involved from a command standpoint. He sent Major Generals Joseph Spencer and Brigadier General Benedict Arnold. There's Benedict Arnold again. He's everywhere, isn't he? And we're not done with Arnold, but
he's limping to battle bravely.
Mm-hmm. Spencer assumed command of the loosely organized militiamen, of whom there were about 3,000. So Spencer and Arnold began planning to capture Newport. Arnold wrote to Washington to request reinforcements, but Washington said no. With the enlistments of many militiamen set to expire, the generals had to table the plans to capture the city. There's yet another theme that we've mentioned many times, the idea that the militiamen would sign up for a very limited period of time, maybe a few months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and then they would just go home. So the commanders were always having to deal with their armies, one day there, one day gone, or at least mostly gone. Benedict Arnold went to Connecticut, and he helped fend off a British attack there, and we won't go into details about that because it's kind of tertiary to what we're talking about here. But we will talk about what happened next. On July 10th, a small group of patriots landed on Aquidneck Island, captured the British commander. That's quite an impressive accomplishment. He was staying in a lightly guarded and isolated house, not very secure. And they took the commander back to Patriot lines. And he would stay a prisoner for 9 months until he was exchanged for, can you guess, listeners, who do you think he was exchanged for? I'll give you a hint. It's one of Scott and my least favorite American generals, Charles Lee.
Wow, heck of a bargain. Who was in charge of that negotiation?
Yeah, I would have just said, just keep General Lee. We'll keep this guy. Or you can just have him, but just keep Lee. We don't want him. Anyway, this was before the full extent of Lee's incompetence revealed itself. All right, so General Howe sent to replace this commander who had been captured. He sent a man named Major General Robert Piggott to take over command of Newport. And Spencer, the American commander in the area, had been promised the raising of 8,000 new militia. So he begins planning a new effort to take Newport. The troops were scheduled to rendezvous on October 1st, but Yet another theme that we see again and again in any war, delays. Delays were caused by the states taking too long to raise regiments and a lack of boats and weapons to ferry the troops. That's one thing sometimes we forget about, but they didn't have Scott and I were talking about this offline earlier. They didn't have the bridges that we have now. You know, if you drive around Rhode Island, you go through Newport and then you continue up into Massachusetts, you could be forgiven for not even noticing, if you're not paying attention, that it is an island. But they could not miss that fact back in those days because they didn't have the bridges, and so they had to have boats. And if you don't have the boats, you can't do the attack. And that's exactly what happened here. British spies informed Piggott of the American effort, and on the 19th, British artillery fired on the Americans. Come and take it. Basically, come on, guys, we're ready.
Leonidas there, come and take them?
Exactly. Come get us. And heavy rains fell, strong winds blew, once again, the effect of weather. This is almost, Scott, this whole campaign is like let's review all the different themes we've talked about. They're all present here in Rhode Island.
Weather, desertion.
Yeah, weather, desertion, people, enlistments expiring, going home, needing supplies that don't show up. Benedict Arnold, all the themes. Anyway, so Patriot militia began to desert, and by October 26th, there were only 5,300 Patriots left. So Spencer calls off the expedition, resigned his commission, and further American attempts to take Newport would just have to wait until next year. So that's the first attempt on the American part to try to take Rhode Island. It doesn't even really happen.
Yeah, before we get to the next stage of battle, this just popped into my mind. One of the main themes of the Revolutionary War is the challenges of keeping together the stitched-together army and enlistments expiring. In World War II, I don't think this thought ever enters anyone's mind as they're learning about it because, well, the troops are deployed overseas, so you can't desert, obviously.
Yeah, I'm going to go home.
I'm going to swim across the Pacific. There's obviously a better military infrastructure. Almost nobody is lacking for food. There are, cases in the Pacific campaign where logistic lines are stretched thin, but it's nothing compared to this. In the Civil War, I think when we talked about it, I don't remember much about desertion except when the South crosses into Union territory, you do see some desertions early on, but it never seems to be the scale of the Revolutionary War. We don't have to go too far into this, but is it just a simple matter of America becoming more wealthy as the decades go on and they can levy taxes, they can provide for a wartime economy, or are there explicit lessons learned from the Revolutionary War that America considers, let's do this and this and this so we don't just have to build a parachute as we're falling out of the plane and maintain an army as we're also trying to plan for battles? And do you have any sense of this, James, one way or another?
At the beginning of the Civil War, they did have a lot of people that enlisted for very brief periods. In fact, when Lincoln first called for volunteers to put down the rebellion, it was for 90 days. But I think it didn't take the leaders on both sides to realize that we need to get people in here for the long haul. We can't just be having people come for 1 year or 2 years. And by the way, and both sides also instituted a draft. That's kind of, so they had learned from the experience of these really short enlistments, and they started bringing in people, drafting them, and also having them enlist for the duration of the war. As far as deserters, there were a lot of deserters, but one thing you have to remember is if you're a northerner, almost all the fighting occurred in the South, and if you're a northerner and you desert, you look like the other people in the area. You could be mistaken for a local, but until you opened your mouth,
right.
And then people would realize, you ain't from the South, are you, son? So yeah, there are some significant differences. There had been learning by then, and also just the fact that you could. I think there was perhaps more patriotism too, but that could be debated. I don't know. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far. Just one last thing with this is, in looking at the very different case of the Ottoman Empire in my end, if you go back far enough in history before the modern era, before the 19th century, when there's better communication networks, there are telegraphs, it's easier to keep track on who are enlisted men, how many are in this or that regiment, whatever. When you don't have all that information at your disposal, when communication lines are shoddy and broken, when travel is by foot or by horseback, then slipping through the cracks is a much easier affair. And simply raising up an army and getting it to arrive at the place that